I still remember the strange feeling I had that first night in our new apartment. It was a quiet neighborhood, you know? The kind of place where kids play outside and people walk their dogs. I thought it would be the perfect spot to start fresh with my daughter, far from any trouble. That day, we were exhausted from moving in, so I made a quick dinner, put my daughter to bed, and finally stretched out on the couch, just enjoying the silence. I was almost dozing off when I heard the doorbell ring. I checked the clock. It was past 10 p.m. Who would ring my bell at this hour? I froze for a second, not sure what to do. Normally, I would have just ignored it, but something felt off. I got up slowly and crept toward the door, trying not to make any noise, so I wouldn't wake my daughter. I peeked through the peephole and saw a woman standing outside. She looked a bit anxious, glancing around, but I didn't see anyone else. I took a deep breath and asked what she wanted, without opening the door. She said she needed to use the phone, that she'd run into some kind of trouble and didn't know what to do. I hesitated, still feeling uneasy, but decided to offer to make a call for her without opening the door. I told her I could make a call for her, but I wouldn't be opening the door. She was quiet for a moment, and I thought she might have left, but then I heard a low sound, almost like she was chuckling to herself. Then, her voice came back, but now it sounded more urgent, almost desperate, begging me to open the door and saying it was an emergency and she needed to come inside. That change in tone set off alarms in my head. Her voice, which had seemed nervous, now sounded manipulative, like she was trying to convince me to let her in no matter what. My heart started pounding, and this awful feeling washed over me. I told her I couldn't help and, if she needed anything, I could call the police. What happened next chilled me to the core. She stopped insisting and went silent again. But then I heard footsteps, someone else's footsteps coming up the stairs. The hallway was dark, but I could make out a shadow from the peephole as another person approached. That's when the woman changed her tone again, now sounding annoyed, like she'd lost her patience. She said she knew I was inside and that I needed to open the door. Then, a man's voice joined hers, telling me to stop hiding and just open up. The panic was rising, but I knew I had to stay calm, especially with my daughter asleep in the next room. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the police, but then I realized my phone had no signal. I'd heard some neighbors complain about the lousy cell reception in this area, but I didn't think it would be this bad. My hands started shaking, and I glanced towards my daughter's room, trying to figure out what to do. My mind was racing, wondering if I should pick her up and run out the back door. But the back door led to a dark alley, and the thought of stepping into that darkness with my daughter in my arms freaked me out even more. I went back to the door and tried to sound firm, saying that the police were on their way. I hoped that would scare them off, but all I heard in response was this low, muffled laugh, like they were amused by my attempt to intimidate them. Then, everything went quiet. I couldn't see anything through the peephole except this strange shadow in the hallway, like they were standing right in front of the door, just waiting. Each second felt like forever, and I kept trying to think of a way out, but any sudden move might catch their attention, and I couldn't risk that. My heart was racing. I decided to try something else, so I went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and crept back to the door, trying not to make a sound. My hands were sweaty, and my legs felt weak, but holding that knife gave me a tiny bit of confidence, even though I knew it might not do much. Still, anything felt better than being completely helpless. I waited, not moving, and listened, trying to pick up any noise that would tell me they'd left. But instead, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was like someone was slowly turning the doorknob, trying to be quiet about it. That's when I realized this was way more serious than I'd thought at first. They weren't just here to ask for help. They were actually trying to get inside, no matter what I said. In that moment, I knew I couldn't lose it. I had to keep my head straight and do whatever it took to protect my daughter, who was still asleep, totally unaware of the danger outside. I took a few steps back, clutching the knife, and kept telling myself that, if it came to it, I'd be ready to fight. On the other side of the door, everything went silent again, but I knew they were still there. That silence was somehow worse, like they were figuring out their next move. My mind was a mess of fear and adrenaline, and every little noise felt magnified. The sound of my own heartbeat, the rustling of the curtains in the wind, even the faint creaks from the buildings sounded too loud. I don't know how long I stood there, just waiting. Part of me started to wonder if maybe I was imagining things, but everything in me screamed that the danger was real and that they were just waiting for the right moment. Then, I heard a whisper, low and drawn out, coming from right near the door, almost as if someone was leaning against the peephole. "We know you're in there," the woman whispered in this cold, almost playful voice. Every word felt like a threat, like she was messing with me. I gripped the knife harder, trying to keep my breathing steady so they wouldn't hear how scared I was. I wanted to scream or bang on the door to scare them off, but I knew any reaction could make things even worse. Then I heard footsteps moving away down the hall, like someone was leaving. But then, out of nowhere, everything went completely quiet. I stood there, not sure if they were actually gone or just hiding, waiting for me to make a move. My head was spinning with so many thoughts. I considered running out to a neighbor's place for help, but I had no idea if they were lurking nearby, just waiting for me to unlock the door. Every second felt like some kind of twisted endurance test, and all I could think about was keeping my daughter safe. After what felt like an eternity, I finally heard footsteps going down the stairs. I waited a few more minutes, still not entirely sure it was safe. Then I peeked through the peephole one last time, and the hallway was empty. No sign of the woman or the man. Even though the immediate threat was gone, my whole body was still on edge, and all I could think about was locking every window and entrance in the apartment. The fears stayed with me, like they could still be out there, watching from the shadows, ready to come back. That night was supposed to be just another typical gaming night, where we'd lose track of time playing video games. My parents were heading to a party, so I took the chance to go to my friend's place and hang out. His house always felt safe, with a tall fence around it, and he was the type who locked everything up. We were so caught up in the game that we didn't even notice when his parents left. It was late, probably past 11, and everything was quiet, too quiet, looking back now. I started hearing a noise coming from the kitchen, but I brushed it off, thinking it was the wind or maybe some stray cat messing around outside. My friend heard it too, but we ignored it and got back to the game. A few minutes later, the noise came back, but this time it was louder, more persistent. I decided to get up and check it out, feeling a little annoyed and already coming up with excuses in case it was just my imagination. When I got to the kitchen and looked through the window, my heart froze. There was a man right there, at the back gate, trying to open it. He was pressed up against the glass door, looking inside like it was the most normal thing in the world. He looked around 40, with a scruffy beard and clothes that didn't exactly scream family friend. But he kept saying he was, insisting that he needed to speak with someone in the house. He kept knocking on the glass door, but he didn't seem anxious or nervous. If anything, he was disturbingly calm. He said he was a friend of my friend's parents and needed to come inside to grab something they'd left for him. I knew my friend's parents were pretty careful about who they let in, which immediately made me suspicious. I tried to keep my cool and told him they weren't home and that he should come back another time. But he kept pushing, saying he'd only need a minute and knew exactly where to find what he was looking for. A chill ran down my spine. I just knew something was really off about this guy. I went back to the room, trying to think of what to do, and by then my friend was as freaked out as I was. He suggested we call his parents, but I knew they probably wouldn't answer since they were at the party. At that point, the guy started rattling the door handle, and I could tell he was trying to force it open. My mind was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. I ran to the front door to double-check that it was locked, and finally, my friend grabbed the phone and decided to call the police. While my friend was on the phone with the police, I stayed in the kitchen, trying to see if the man was still there. He wasn't messing with the handle anymore, but now I could see him pacing back and forth, like he was figuring out another way in. I started wondering if he might be armed, or if there was anyone else with him. The feeling of being trapped with this guy outside was overwhelming. Time felt like it was crawling, and the silence between his movements just made the whole situation even scarier. The police said they were on their way, but honestly, it felt like they'd take forever. Suddenly, he stopped right in front of the glass door, put his hands in his pockets, and gave us this weird, unsettling smile. Like he was enjoying himself, like it was all some kind of game to him. He knocked again, harder this time, and said something like, "You really don't want to keep me waiting?" That sent chills down my spine. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. What if he managed to break in, or had some tool to force his way inside? I was trying to think of anything we could do to buy some time until the police arrived. I yelled that the police were on their way, hoping that'd scare him off, but he just laughed. It was this low, mocking laugh, like he didn't believe me or didn't care. He got even closer to the door, his face inches from the glass, and I could see his eyes locked onto me. There was something seriously wrong with the way he looked at me, a calmness that made everything even more terrifying. He muttered something under his breath that I couldn't catch, but it sounded like he was saying this wasn't over. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what he meant, and then I heard the sirens in the distance. Hearing those sirens was like the weight of the world lifted off my shoulders for a second. I looked at my friend, who was just as pale as me, and gave him a nod to show that help was finally coming. Outside, the man heard the sirens too, and his face changed. That calm expression disappeared, and he started backing away from the door. I watched as he looked around, clearly trying to find an escape route. He shot one last look back at the house, and the way he stared at us made me feel like this wasn't really over. Then he turned and ran off into the dark. The police arrived within minutes, but to me, it felt like hours had passed. They came in and checked the entire area around the house, but of course, the man was already gone. Once they finished their sweep and made sure everything was secure, one of the officers came over to talk to us. We explained everything, every single detail, but it was hard to fully describe just how terrifying it had been. The officers said they'd do a patrol around the neighborhood, but honestly, I knew he was long gone by then. Still, the feeling of unease stayed with us. After the police left, the house felt weirdly empty. My friend and I sat there in silence for a while, just processing everything that had happened. Every little sound after that made us jump, and neither of us could shake the feeling that the man might somehow come back. I think that's what bothered me the most, not knowing who he was, what he wanted, or why he chose that night to try and get in. It was like he had disappeared into thin air, leaving us with nothing but questions and a lingering fear. When my friend's parents finally got back, we told them everything. They were shocked, of course, and kept apologizing for not being there. But there was nothing they could have done, really. Even with the police involved, it felt like a mystery with no real answers. All I know is, after that night, I never felt the same about being alone in a house, even in broad daylight. The memory of that man's face, his voice, and that horrible smile still haunt me whenever I'm home alone. To this day, I have no idea who he was or what he really wanted. Maybe he was just some creep looking for trouble. Maybe he was waiting for a chance to do something worse. Whatever the case, the way he looked at me before he left still gives me chills. It's like he wanted me to remember him, to keep me wondering if he'd ever show up again. And honestly, that thought still makes it hard to sleep some nights. It was just a regular Saturday, one of those slow days, you know? My kids were out with their dad for the day, and I figured I'd take advantage of the peace and quiet to work on the garden, which had been needing some attention for a while. My backyard's pretty big, with trees and plants I try to keep alive, even though I'm not exactly the best at gardening. It was early afternoon when I started, the sun still high but with a nice breeze that made it bearable. Everything was so calm. I almost forgot that I've always had a bit of an uneasy feeling in this neighborhood. Too much silence messes with your mind, especially in a place where you rarely see anyone around. Toward the evening, as I was trimming some dry branches near the back of the yard, I heard someone call my name. It was a muffled Mariana. That made me stop what I was doing and just listen, wondering if I'd heard right. At first, I thought it was one of the neighbors, but the voice sounded strange, too familiar yet somehow impossible to place. I glanced around, towards the fence, but didn't see anyone. Shaking it off, I figured it must have been my imagination. Maybe I was just tired. I tried to ignore it and keep working, but there was this weird feeling in my gut, like someone was actually watching me from somewhere. After a few minutes, I forced myself to get back to work, but suddenly, I started noticing shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, right at the far end of the yard, near the trees. They were quick, like the kind of movement that makes you question if you really saw anything at all, or if it was just the light playing tricks. I tried focusing on the plants, but that creepy feeling just kept getting stronger. I looked over again and swear I saw a shadow pass between the trees, silent, like it was hiding. My heart was racing, but I kept trying to brush it off, because nobody wants to believe stuff like that, right? But no matter how much I told myself it was just paranoia, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. That's when I decided it was time to go inside. I just wanted to be done and feel safe inside the house. I grabbed my tools and went straight to the kitchen, dropping everything by the sink. Only after I was inside and closed the door did I realize I'd left the back door unlocked the whole time. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to brush it off as just nerves. But then, a few minutes later, as I was putting some things away, I heard a strange sound coming from the living room. It was faint, but it sounded like footsteps, like someone was moving around in there, trying not to be noticed. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was off. That voice, the shadows outside, and now this noise. It all felt like it was adding up in the worst possible way. I grabbed my phone, thinking I'd call someone, but I couldn't figure out who. Honestly, I felt a bit ridiculous. I tried to tiptoe down the hallway, where the sound seemed closer, but as I got there, everything went quiet again, and the air felt so thick it was hard to ignore. I had this sense that if I took one more step, someone would be there waiting for me. The house, which always felt warm and safe, suddenly seemed like a trap. The back door was still unlocked, and the fear that someone had quietly slipped inside was clouding my thoughts. I decided to close the kitchen door and lock myself in my bedroom for a while, just until I felt ready to check the whole house. But just as I turned the key to lock my bedroom door, I heard a faint creak coming from the hallway, like someone leaning against the wall. My heart was pounding so hard, I honestly thought I might pass out. I stayed there, glued to the door, straining to hear any other sounds. Every second of silence only made my fear worse, like the next noise would confirm I wasn't alone. I tried to control my breathing, but the fear was so intense I could hardly think straight. The only thing going through my mind was, what if there really is someone in here? I picked up my phone again, debating whether to call the police, but the thought of making any noise terrified me. I knew that if someone was actually in the house, even the smallest sound might give me away. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a soft thud from the opposite end of the hallway, like someone stepping on one of those squeaky floorboards. That was enough to convince me that I wasn't alone. My only thought was to get out, no matter what. I finally managed to unlock the window, and, with my hands shaking, I squeezed myself through. The feeling of leaving my own home, actually escaping, felt surreal and humiliating. But the fear was stronger than anything else. Once I was out in the yard, the first thing I did was look back at the back door. From where I stood, I could see it still slightly open, swinging a little in the wind. Just the sight of that open door, with the darkness beyond, made my skin crawl. It was like my own house had turned against me. I ran to the house next door, not even looking back. All I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between me and that place. I rang my neighbor's doorbell a bunch of times, and she opened up, alarmed at the look on my face. I tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled, and all I managed to say was that there was someone in my house. She looked worried and let me in, locking the door behind me, but I still felt like I was being watched, like whatever was in my house could somehow reach me there too. It wasn't until she offered me a glass of water that I felt a bit more grounded, realizing where I was. My neighbor asked if I wanted to call the police, and I knew I probably should, but I hesitated. The idea of explaining everything made me feel embarrassed, almost like I'd sound crazy. I mean, what did I really have? A voice, shadows, footsteps. Nothing concrete, but terrifying enough to make me run from my own house. I sat there, trying to convince myself it might have all been in my head, until suddenly we heard a noise from outside. It was the sound of a door slamming. The back door of my house, which I'd left slightly open, now closing with force, like someone had finally decided to leave. The noise echoed in the night, and my neighbor and I exchanged a horrified look. She tried to reassure me, saying it could have been the wind, but something about that sound felt deliberate. I stayed frozen, listening to the silence that followed, hoping to catch any other sign that someone had just walked out. But everything stayed quiet, like the house was empty again, with no trace of whoever, or whatever, had scared me out of it. In that moment, I felt a weird flash of bravery, just enough to sneak a glance from a distance to make sure everything was actually okay. We walked together to the edge of her fence, and I looked back at my house, now completely dark and silent. No matter how hard I tried to make sense of what happened, the idea of going back inside made my skin crawl. I ended up staying at her place that night, and to this day, I have no idea what really went down. I never found any signs of forced entry or anything that could explain the noises or the voice calling my name. All I know is that, after that day, I never felt truly safe there again, and the feeling of being watched by someone or something still haunts me to this day. You know, I've never really been the paranoid type. I was 18, loved going out, meeting new people, and honestly, never thought something bizarre could happen to me. It was just another regular afternoon when I went to the grocery store to pick up a few things for my mom. Everything seemed normal. The place was pretty empty, and as I walked through the aisles, I noticed this guy, maybe in his 30s, looking my way. I thought it was weird, but figured it was just a coincidence. Everyone bumps into someone at the store, right? But then he stopped next to me in the checkout line and started chatting. He even asked my name like it was the most normal thing in the world. I gave him a hesitant answer, and he smiled. This smile that felt off. I left the store trying to shake off the weird vibe, but the guy ended up walking the same way as me into the parking lot. That's when I started to feel really uncomfortable. When I got to my car, I noticed he'd stopped a few yards away, just staring at me, not even pretending otherwise. I wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. I got in my car quickly, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, he was still standing there, just watching. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was waiting for someone. But as I drove home, this strange feeling kept creeping in, like I wasn't actually alone. Once I got home, that uneasy feeling was still there, but I tried to shake it off. I went straight to my room and tried to relax. But about 20 minutes later, I heard a noise outside, like someone stepping on the dried leaves in our yard. I thought it was my imagination at first, but then I heard someone whispering my name, real soft. My heart started racing. I froze, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, and then I went to my window to peek outside. At first, I didn't see anything, but the feeling that someone was there, watching me, only got stronger. I stood there for a while, too freaked out to even think about opening the door. Then I heard my name again, only this time louder and way closer. The voice was unmistakable. It was that guy from the grocery store. He was outside my house, calling my name like we'd known each other forever. My first reaction was to lock the front door and turn off all the lights, trying to make it seem like nobody was home. The silence was broken by more footsteps in the yard, each one coming closer to my bedroom window. I couldn't move, completely paralyzed with fear. My heart was pounding so hard I could almost hear it echoing in my head. Suddenly, I heard a louder noise, like he'd tripped over something outside. For a second, I thought maybe he'd given up and left, but as soon as I reached for my phone, I heard footsteps again, closer this time, almost right up against the wall of my bedroom. I looked out the window again, trying not to be seen, and I swear I saw a shadow moving between the bushes. And the worst part? He kept whispering my name, like he was calling me out to join him. It felt like some sick game he was playing, like he was enjoying seeing me scared. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, trying to explain what was happening without raising my voice too much. He lived close by and said I could crash at his place until things calmed down. I figured that was my chance to get out. I took my car keys and quietly went to the front door, trying not to make a sound. When I stepped outside, I looked around and didn't see anyone, so I sprinted to my car. But before I could close the door, I heard that voice again, right behind me. "Hey, don't leave so soon." That's when the real panic hit. I slammed the car door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I tried to drive off, he came up to my window and knocked, with this look on his face like he was satisfied, like he enjoyed seeing me so freaked out. He was saying something I couldn't make out, but it felt like he was taunting me, testing how far he could push me. I started the car and sped off, not even looking back. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. I managed to put some distance between me and my house, but the feeling that he was somehow following me wouldn't go away. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see him pop up behind me at any moment. As I got closer to my friend's place, I stopped the car at the corner to look around. Everything seemed quiet, but deep down, I knew he was still nearby, somehow lurking in the shadows. When I finally parked in front of my friend's house, I got out of the car fast and went straight to his door. I knocked a few times until he opened, and for the first time, I felt a little bit of relief. I told him what had happened, but as I was explaining, I could see this look of doubt on his face, like he thought I was exaggerating or something. He tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just some random weirdo who'd followed me by coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I couldn't shake the memory of how that guy whispered my name, like he'd known me forever. We stayed in the living room for a while, and I tried to distract myself with whatever my friend was saying, but it was impossible to relax. That feeling that something was still wrong wouldn't leave me. After a while, I decided to head home, even though I was still scared out of my mind. As I left his place, that sick feeling in my stomach came rushing back. I looked around before getting in my car, but there was no one there. The second I put the key in the ignition, though, I heard that whisper again, coming from somewhere in the dark. It was like he'd been waiting for me all along. My whole body froze, and this shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't see anyone around, but that whisper was unmistakable. He was there, hiding in the shadows, watching my every move. All I could do was start the car and drive off as fast as I could. On the way back, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting him to pop up behind me any second. Every shadow on the road seemed to take his shape, and the fear was so strong I could barely breathe. I got home and locked myself in my room, too terrified to go outside for anything. That night felt endless, filled with noises I couldn't tell if they were real or just in my head. Even days later, I still find myself looking out the window, half expecting to see him appear out of nowhere, just like that day. I don't know who he was or why he followed me, but I'm convinced he chose me for a reason. To this day, whenever I remember that whisper at my door, I feel like he's still out there, just waiting for the right time to come back.